Steel screeched as rail lines buckled under precise explosions. German generals lounged in commandeered villas, dismissing reports as exaggerations. Minor annoyances, they called them. Outside, 30,000 shadows moved through mountain passes and forest depths, each carrying the collective rage of a nation. German generals never saw it coming. Wasn't just a military miscalculation. It was blindness born of arrogance. Blood would soon stain their confidence. Subscribe to witness how empire crumbles when it underestimates the power of a people with nothing left to lose. General Dieter Hoffmann swirled cognac in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid catch the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows of what had once been a Yugoslav government office. Now it served as his personal headquarters in Belgrade, the furniture rearranged to his liking, local art replaced with maps and German military insignia. Outside, a gentle spring breeze carried the scent of blossoming trees, mingling with the acrid undertones of diesel from German trucks that rumbled constantly through the occupied city's streets. The sounds of military order, marching boots, shouted German commands, the occasional backfire of a military vehicle had become the heartbeat of Belgrade under occupation. "These partisan attacks are nothing more than pinpricks, Müller," Hoffmann said dismissively to his aide, who stood rigidly at attention before the massive oak desk. The morning report lay open between them, detailing another night of sabotage. A blown culvert, a derailed supply train, an ambushed patrol. Rain had begun to patter against the windows, darkening the sky over the city as if nature itself disagreed with the general's assessment. The aide's face remained carefully neutral, though he had spent the previous night listening to radio reports of increasing partisan activity across 3 separate regions, each incident marked by a growing boldness that troubled him deeply. "Perhaps, Herr General, but the frequency is increasing," Müller ventured cautiously, the leather of his polished boots creaking slightly as he shifted his weight. A distant rumble of thunder punctuated his words, while somewhere in the building a door slammed shut with unexpected force. The walls of the room were thick with the residual memories of the building's former Yugoslav occupants, as if their ghosts listened in disapproval to the German dismissal of their countrymen's resistance. Hoffmann's signet ring clinked against the glass as he set it down with deliberate slowness. Across the occupied territories of Yugoslavia, similar conversations were taking place in commandeered mansions, government buildings, and military outposts. German generals, secure in their conquest, failed to perceive the gathering storm. They saw only scattered bands of resistance fighters, farmers, teachers, former soldiers, not a coordinated force capable of strategic thinking. The evening light began to fade from the room as clouds thickened overhead, casting premature shadows across the maps that detailed German supply routes through the mountainous country. The same maps that, unknown to them, had been meticulously copied by cleaning staff and passed through a complex network of resistance informants over the preceding months. In the mountains south of Belgrade, as German generals dismissed their threat, Josip Broz Tito studied similar maps by lamplight in a cave that served as the partisan headquarters. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke, and the earthy smell of dozens of fighters crowded into the space, their faces illuminated by the flickering yellow light that cast giant, moving shadows on the rough stone walls. Outside, sentries stood in the rain, water dripping from their caps as they peered into the darkness, listening for the approach of German patrols over the steady patter of raindrops on leaves and the occasional distant howl of a wolf deep in the forest. What the German command failed to understand, what their arrogance prevented them from seeing, was that these scattered attacks were not random acts of defiance, but carefully coordinated probes, testing German responses, identifying weaknesses in the supply lines that stretched like vulnerable arteries across the rugged Balkan landscape. As lightning briefly illuminated the cave entrance, Tito's finger traced a railroad junction on the map, his eyes reflecting not just the lamplight, but the fire of absolute conviction that would soon burn through the heart of German occupation. The mountain village of Dervar sat nestled in a valley, morning mist curling between simple stone houses like spectral fingers. A German patrol passed through twice weekly, their boots echoing on the cobbled main street, rifles held at the ready, eyes wary and suspicious of the seemingly docile populace who kept their gazes downcast and their doors firmly shut. But behind those weathered wooden doors, in cellars dug deep into the rocky earth, partisan messengers exchanged information in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the uncertain light of tallow candles that cast elongated shadows across walls adorned with faded family photographs and religious icons that had witnessed generations of both peace and strife in these mountains. Mila Petrovich kneaded bread dough with strong flour-covered hands, the rhythmic motion a cover for her racing thoughts as she mentally rehearsed the message she would deliver to the mountain camp after nightfall. At 45, her weathered face and grey-streaked hair made her invisible to the occupying forces, just another peasant woman going about her daily chores. The German officer who occasionally requisitioned her fresh bread never noticed how her eyes catalogued the patches on his uniform, the weapons his men carried, or how many trucks accompanied them on each patrol. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from breakfast fires, mingling with the yeasty smell of rising bread and the distant metallic clang of someone repairing farm tools in the village square. Children played in the dirt streets, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the grim reality of occupation. They had become expert lookouts, their games a sophisticated system of signals that could warn of approaching German patrols with innocent-seeming shouts and calls. Today, they kicked a ball made of rags near the village well, occasionally glancing toward the mountain road where dust might signal approaching vehicles. The sun broke through the morning clouds, warming the stone walls of the houses and drying the dew that clung to the wildflowers growing between cobblestones. Nature's persistent reclamation of human spaces, much like the resistance that grew despite German efforts to stamp it out. 10 kilometers away, in a forest clearing invisible from the air, Ivan Kovac instructed 20 new recruits in the art of demolition. His hands, once those of a mining engineer, now demonstrated how to place explosives for maximum effect on railway lines. The key is not just to damage, he explained, voice low but intense, but to destroy in a way that takes the longest to repair. The birds called in the canopy above them, their songs occasionally interrupted by the distant drone of a German reconnaissance plane that caused every head to turn upward, bodies tensing until the sound faded away. The smell of pine resin permeated the air, occasionally overwhelmed by the sharp chemical odor of the explosives they handled with careful reverence. Throughout Yugoslavia, this scene repeated itself 1,000 times over, in mountain villages, forest clearings, urban cellars, and abandoned farms. People who had once been shopkeepers, teachers, farmers, and students now became the sinews of a vast resistance network that stretched across the occupied country. They passed messages written on cigarette papers, memorized train schedules, stole German documents, and mapped patrol routes. Women carried ammunition sewn into the linings of their skirts. Children transported messages in their shoes. Old men who appeared to doze in the sun counted German vehicles and radioed their findings using equipment hidden in haystacks and abandoned wells. In Berlin, intelligence reports of these activities were systematically downgraded in importance, the threat assessment reduced to minimal by officers who could not conceive that an occupied population of Balkan peasants could organize anything approaching a military threat to the Wehrmacht. This blindness, born of ideological contempt and military arrogance, would soon exact a price paid in German blood on the rocky paths and narrow mountain passes of a country whose people had decided that death was preferable to continued subjugation. The partisan camp sprawled through a hidden valley, invisible from the air, thanks to the dense canopy of ancient beech trees that filtered the June sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. 3,000 fighters moved with quiet purpose between tents and lean-tos, their conversations a murmur beneath the constant sounds of the forest. Birds calling, leaves rustling in the gentle mountain breeze, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. The air carried the mingled scents of pine sap, wood smoke from carefully shielded cooking fires, gun oil, and the earthy smell of people who bathed in cold mountain streams. Weapons were cleaned with meticulous care. Maps were studied by lamplight in larger tents. Runners arrived hourly with messages from other camps scattered across the mountainous terrain. Commander Ana Lukic, once a university history professor and now one of Tito's most trusted lieutenants, stood at the edge of the camp watching new recruits practice hand-to-hand combat techniques. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, her face weathered by 2 years in the mountains, eyes constantly scanning the periphery even as she assessed the fighting skills being developed before her. "They're improving," remarked the grizzled former Royal Yugoslav Army sergeant who stood beside her, his beard now streaked with grey, uniform replaced by the mismatched clothing that characterized the partisan forces. "But will they be ready in time?" A woodpecker hammered at a distant tree, the sound like distant gunfire, causing several of the newer recruits to flinch momentarily before continuing their training. 50 kilometers to the north, German supply trucks rumbled along a mountain road, drivers unaware of being observed through binoculars by partisan scouts hidden among the rocky outcroppings that overlooked the convoy route. The scouts noted everything: the number of trucks, the spacing between vehicles, the types of supplies being transported, the strength of the escort. The afternoon sun beat down on the exposed rocks, creating heat mirages above the road surface, while cicadas droned incessantly in the scrub vegetation that clung to the hillsides. One scout quietly sketched the convoy's formation on a small pad of paper, his pencil moving swiftly to capture essential details before the dust cloud marking the convoy's passage disappeared around a bend in the road. In a cave that served as Tito's headquarters, radio operators received encrypted messages from across Yugoslavia, each transmission building a comprehensive picture of German vulnerabilities. The air in the cave was cool compared to the summer heat outside, damp stone walls glistening with moisture that dripped occasionally into small puddles on the uneven floor. Maps covered a rough wooden table, illuminated by kerosene lamps that cast warm yellow light and long shadows across the serious faces of the partisan leadership gathered around them. Red pins marked German garrisons. Blue lines traced supply routes. Yellow markers indicated confirmed partisan units ready to mobilize. The soft crackle of the radio and the quiet murmur of conversation were the only sounds, occasionally interrupted by the scrape of a chair or the rustle of paper as new intelligence was incorporated into the evolving battle plan. Throughout Yugoslavia, German forces maintained their occupation with decreasing manpower as troops were diverted to more critical fronts. Supply lines stretched thin across difficult terrain, each mountain pass and river crossing a potential choke point. In Belgrade, General Hoffmann received reports of isolated attacks, but failed to recognize the pattern emerging. The way these attacks were increasing in frequency, but remaining just below the threshold that would trigger a major response. Outside his headquarters, summer heat baked the city streets, the air heavy with humidity and the smell of dust and diesel exhaust. German soldiers in the city had loosened their collars in the heat, their alertness dulled by months of routine occupation duties and the false sense of security that came with controlling major population centers. The plan that Tito and his commanders had spent months developing was breathtaking in its audacity and scope, a simultaneous strike against German supply lines across the entire country, targeting not just individual convoys, but the very infrastructure of occupation. Radio transmitters hidden in barns, attics, and cave systems would coordinate the attacks, giving the scattered partisan forces the cohesion of a conventional army without the vulnerability of centralized command. As twilight deepened over the mountains, turning the landscape into a silhouette of black ridges against the deep blue sky. Tito made his decision. The coded message went out by radio and courier. The storm begins in 3 days. Dawn broke over Yugoslavia with the muted colors of early autumn, golden light touching the mountain peaks first, then slowly illuminating valleys, still shrouded in morning mist that clung to river courses and forest hollows like spectral remnants of the night. German sentries at outposts and checkpoints changed shifts, yawning, lighting cigarettes, complaining about the growing chill in the morning air as summer relinquished its hold on the land. They scanned the quiet landscape with practiced indifference, seeing nothing unusual in the peaceful scene. The distant smoke from village chimneys, farmers already in their fields, the occasional civilian cart on country roads. The morning carried the sense of pine forests, damp earth, wood smoke, and the promise of rain later in the day as clouds gathered on the western horizon, dark and heavy with moisture. What the Germans failed to see were the 30,000 shadows that moved with deliberate purpose through forest paths and mountain passes, using terrain they had known since childhood to approach their targets unseen. Farmers carried rifles beneath hay in their carts. Women with grenades hidden in baskets of produce passed through checkpoints with downcast eyes and deferential postures. Children who played near German outposts were counting personnel and equipment with keen eyes trained to remember every detail. The partisan forces moved like water finding its course, flowing around obstacles, gathering strength, converging on predetermined points with the inexorable power of a force too long contained. Birds fell silent as groups of fighters passed beneath their perches, creating momentary zones of unnatural quiet that no German sentry was trained to recognize as the harbinger of impending attack. At precisely noon, as German officers sat down to their midday meals in commandeered villas and headquarters buildings, the first explosions shattered the routine of occupation. Railroad bridges collapsed in synchronized destruction across 6 different regions. Tunnels that had taken years to construct imploded in carefully engineered avalanches. Roads that wound through mountain passes were obliterated by charges set in overhanging cliffs that sent thousands of tons of rock crashing down to create barriers that would take weeks to clear. The sound of explosions echoed through valleys and between mountain peaks, overlapping, reinforcing, becoming a continuous thunder that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Smoke rose in dozens of locations, black columns against the gathering storm clouds, visual exclamation points marking the opening moves of an offensive that had been planned in whispers for months. General Hoffmann was interrupted mid-meal by an ashen-faced aide who burst into the dining room without the customary knock. "Herr General, we are under attack, everywhere at once." The words hung in the air as the sounds of distant explosions reached them, even through the thick walls of the Belgrade headquarters. Outside, the previously orderly streets erupted into chaos as German soldiers ran to defensive positions. Officers shouted contradictory orders, and vehicle engines roared to life. The crystal glasses on the dining table vibrated with each distant detonation, wine rippling in concentric circles like miniature red lakes disturbed by some deep seismic force. Hoffmann's face, previously flushed with good food and confidence, drained of color as reports flooded in from across the occupied territories, reports that painted a picture of coordinated devastation beyond anything he had believed the partisans capable of executing. Supply convoys already en route found themselves trapped between destroyed bridges and impassable mountain roads, suddenly vulnerable in hostile territory. Partisan fighters emerged from forests and ravines, attacking with a combination of captured German weapons, Allied supplies airdropped over previous months, and an intimate knowledge of terrain that negated much of the Germans' superior firepower. The autumn sun broke intermittently through gathering clouds, creating dramatic contrasts of light and shadow across battlefields that stretched from the Adriatic coast to the Bulgarian border. The smell of cordite mingled with the scent of crushed vegetation and disturbed earth as firefights erupted along supply routes that had been secure only hours before. German machine guns chattered in desperate defense. Partisan mortars answered from hillsides. The wounded on both sides cried out in languages that shared no common words except those of pain. As night fell across Yugoslavia, the full scale of the partisan offensive became clear to the stunned German command. Supply lines were not just damaged, but severed in dozens of critical locations. Garrisons that had expected routine resupply now faced isolation in increasingly hostile territory. German forces, accustomed to being the hunters, suddenly found themselves prey, uncertain where the next attack would come from in the darkness that seemed to belong entirely to their enemies. Stars appeared in breaks between clouds, cold and distant, illuminating scenes of destruction across the country, burning vehicles, cratered roads, collapsed bridges, the occasional tracer fire arcing through the night sky like deadly shooting stars. The temperature dropped sharply with nightfall, adding physical discomfort to the psychological shock experienced by German forces who had never anticipated such a massive, coordinated assault from an enemy they had consistently underestimated. 1 week into the offensive, the German occupation of Yugoslavia resembled a body suffering multiple organ failure. Systems that had functioned in coordinated efficiency now operated in isolation, desperately trying to maintain control with diminishing resources and severed communication. Morning fog shrouded the countryside, concealing the extent of destruction from aerial reconnaissance and providing additional cover for partisan forces that continued to strike targets of opportunity. The dampness penetrated everything: uniforms, equipment, food supplies, morale, as autumn rains fell intermittently, turning dirt roads to mud and making repair work on damaged infrastructure nearly impossible. German soldiers huddled in defensive positions, their breath visible in the early morning chill, listening to the sounds of a country that had become uniformly hostile territory. In the hastily established emergency headquarters outside Belgrade, General Hoffmann stared at maps that no longer accurately represented the territory supposedly under his control. Red markers indicating destroyed infrastructure and ambushed convoys created a pattern that even the most optimistic interpretation could not deny: the systematic dismantling of German logistics across Yugoslavia. The room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the particular odor of men who had not slept properly in days. Outside, the steady drip of rainwater from the eaves provided a counterpoint to the tense conversation within. "We need reinforcements from the Eastern Front," his logistics officer stated flatly, voice rough from too many cigarettes and too little sleep. "The Eastern Front has nothing to spare," Hoffmann replied, the words dropping into the room like stones into a still pond. "Berlin says we must resolve the situation with resources already allocated to the Balkans theater." He did not add what they all knew: that Yugoslavia had been considered a secured territory, a backwater of the war where minimal forces should have been sufficient to maintain control. The admission that 30,000 partisans had effectively crippled German operations would be a career-ending report to send to high command. A distant explosion punctuated his words, causing heads to turn toward the sound and adding grim emphasis to the deteriorating situation. Across the country, German garrisons found themselves isolated, communications limited to unreliable radio transmissions, often intercepted by partisan operators who had broken simplified field codes. Supply depots that should have contained weeks of provisions had been systematically targeted, their contents destroyed or, worse from the German perspective, captured intact and now being used against them. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. German soldiers who had seen themselves as invincible occupiers now jumped at shadows and viewed every civilian with suspicion. The sound of wind through mountain passes was mistaken for partisan whispers. The natural creaking of trees in the forest became the imagined movement of fighters preparing to attack. Each unexpected animal call in the night triggered nervous bursts of gunfire that only revealed German positions to watching eyes. In the mountains, Tito received the reports of the offensive's success with cautious satisfaction. "We have shattered their sense of invulnerability," he told his commanders, gathered in the lamplight of their current headquarters. A shepherd's stone hut, expanded with timber reinforcements and camouflaged from aerial observation. But we must press the advantage before they can adapt. The air inside was warm from body heat and the small stove that glowed red in the corner, creating a stark contrast with the autumn chill outside, where sentries paced to keep warm, their breath fogging in the mountain air. Maps spread across rough wooden tables showed the next phase of operations, targeting the remaining German strongholds, now vulnerable without regular resupply, isolating them further until they became unsustainable. The German war machine in Yugoslavia, once a model of efficiency and control, had been reduced to disconnected components struggling to function independently. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles. Ammunition ran low in outposts that could not be resupplied. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties. Communication breakdowns led to contradictory orders and friendly fire incidents. The sound of German motorcycles and trucks, once the constant background noise of occupation, had been replaced by an eerie silence in areas now controlled by partisan forces. Villages that had seemed docile under occupation revealed their true allegiance, providing food, intelligence and recruits to the resistance that moved openly through territories the Germans could no longer contest effectively. The smell of victory, intangible but unmistakable, began to permeate the mountain air, carried on winds that once brought only the scent of pine and distant snow, but now added the acrid tang of burning German equipment and the metallic odor of spilled blood. What the German generals had dismissed as impossible had become their reality, their forces scattered, isolated, and increasingly desperate across a hostile landscape controlled by an enemy they had never taken seriously. The machine that had seemed unstoppable, that had crushed nations across Europe with mechanical precision, now ground to a halt in the mountains and forests of Yugoslavia, its gears stripped, its fuel exhausted, its operators awakening too late to the fatal flaw in their calculations. No force, however technologically superior, can prevail against an entire population willing to risk everything for freedom. As autumn deepened toward winter, the German occupation of Yugoslavia no longer resembled a military operation, but a failing organism, its extremities dying first, as resources focused on maintaining vital centers that themselves were under increasing pressure from a resistance that had become an army in all but name.